welcome back. Today I'll be looking at people who let their egos run wild in amusement parks and paid for that arrogance with their lives.
From a man who walked straight toward a gunman in the middle of a crowd, to a woman who slipped through a gate and leaned over a railing 40 feet off the ground, ending her day at the park in the craziest way possible. It was June 3, 2020, in Orlando, Florida. The amusement park was busy that day. Families moved through the midway between rides, games, and food stands. Mark Jason Carr was 44 years old. A former Marine turned warehouse supervisor, he was there with his wife and adult nephew. Years in the military had left him with a strong belief that he could handle situations most people could not.
I understand where that comes from. But there is a big difference between training for danger and walking toward a loaded weapon in the middle of a crowded park.
The three of them were moving through the midway when a commotion broke out not far ahead. A man had gotten into an argument with park employees, loud enough to stop people in their tracks. The confrontation was happening near the entrance to one of the park's larger rides. Then, without much warning, the man produced a handgun. Witnesses later said he began waving the weapon toward employees and the ride entrance while making threats. At one point, he directed the handgun toward the operator's control area, forcing employees to retreat from the ride. The reaction was immediate. Families pulled children out of line and rushed away. Ride operators backed away from the entrance while trying to move people out of the area. Within seconds, what had been a crowded section of the park turned into a scene of confusion and panic. Mark's wife grabbed his arm the moment she saw the gun. He looked at her, pulled free, and turned back toward the armed man. She called after him, but he kept walking. Mark seemed convinced he could handle the situation himself. An armed man was threatening park employees and guests in the middle of a crowded amusement park, and Mark appeared to believe he could get close enough to stop or disarm him before anyone else got hurt. The gunman was roughly 30 feet away, backing away slowly with the weapon raised. Mark walked toward him, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving at a steady pace, like he had already decided how this was going to end. His wife stayed a few steps behind, still calling out. His nephew had stopped moving entirely. A few of them shouted at Mark to turn around. The gunman was doing the same, warning him more than once to stay back. Mark did not slow down. 20 feet became 15. 15 became 10. Witnesses described his movement as calm and deliberate, like the warnings were not landing at all. That is not bravery. That is a person who stopped listening the moment he made up his mind. The gunman kept backing up but was running out of open ground. Mark did not stop. The gap kept closing 9 feet, 8, 7. His hands were loose at his sides, eyes straight ahead. His wife stood several feet back, still calling his name. Witnesses later said Mark appeared to be trying to disarm the gunman, but he continued closing the distance despite repeated warnings.
By then, the gunman had nowhere left to retreat. A food stand and a row of barriers were directly behind him.
Witnesses later said he raised the handgun higher as Mark continued forward. The distance between them shrank to only a few feet. Then Mark took another step forward and reached out with one hand, appearing to move toward the weapon itself. The shot came immediately. The round struck Mark in the upper chest. He took one step back, then went down hard onto the concrete midway. His wife moved toward him immediately. Security reached the scene within minutes. Emergency responders followed shortly after. The gunman was taken into custody by officers who arrived at the park. Mark never regained consciousness. The medical examiner later confirmed that the cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the chest. The gunman was arrested at the scene and later faced criminal charges. The amusement park reopened after investigators completed their work. Mark left behind his wife and family. His death remains a reminder that confidence is not the same thing as control. Once he decided to approach an armed man, the outcome was no longer entirely his to determine. The next case also happened at an amusement park, but this time the danger came from the ride itself, and every person on board watched it happen in real time. It was July 8th, 2018, in Wisconsin Dells, Wisconsin. The water park was packed with families escaping the summer heat. Near the back of the park, a raft ride drew a steady line of riders throughout the afternoon. Wylana Gage was 38 years old. She worked in medical billing and was raising her 2 children, mostly on her own after her divorce. By most accounts, she was a present and involved mother. But somewhere along the way, being the fun parent had become something she needed people to see.
I don't think Yolana was naturally reckless, but needing an audience can quietly change your decisions, especially when your own children are behind the camera.
She had been waiting in line with her 2 kids when they brought up a video they had seen online. In it, someone stood up inside a moving raft on a ride like this one. Wailana immediately said she could do the same. A few nearby families overheard her, and that small audience seemed to encourage her. Before loading, attendants gave the standard instructions: stay seated, hold the handles, and keep your body inside the raft at all times. Wailana heard them, nodded, and sat beside her kids. One of them was already holding a phone. The raft left the station and entered a calm section of the channel. When it reached a wider curve, Wailana stood up and stretched her arms out to her sides. She smiled toward her kids as other riders told her to sit down. She ignored them and remained standing as the raft continued through the turn.
Moments later, she lost her balance and fell into the channel. The current carried her forward, but the raft was traveling down the same chute behind her.
Because both were moving in the same direction, she had almost no time to get clear before it caught up. As she tried to regain her footing, the raft reached her. The channel was designed with only a narrow gap between the raft and the concrete wall. The raft pushed her sideways into that space as the current carried both forward. She surfaced just as the channel narrowed toward the runout area. The raft pressed her against the concrete guide wall and continued moving with the force of the water behind it. Trapped between the raft and the wall, she had no room to move away or escape beneath it. Passengers began shouting. Operators stopped the ride, and lifeguards entered the channel within minutes. Her children remained seated in the raft until staff guided it to the unloading platform and helped them off. Wailana was pulled from the channel and taken to a nearby hospital. She passed away later that same day. The medical examiner determined that her cause of death was blunt force trauma and compression injuries sustained when her body was caught between the moving raft and the concrete channel wall. The ride remained closed while investigators reviewed the accident and park staff cooperated with state officials. The investigation ultimately concluded that Wailana's decision to stand inside the moving raft led to the chain of events that followed. No major mechanical defects were identified, though the incident prompted renewed discussion about rider compliance and safety enforcement. Her children later returned home without their mother, forced to process a loss that had unfolded in front of them within a matter of seconds.
The hardest part is that her kids were right there beside her. Their last memory of that ride is seeing their mother smiling moments before the accident.
The next one starts with a dare between 2 friends and ends on a pirate ship ride in Missouri. It was August 16th, 2017, in Branson, Missouri. The amusement park was steady, but not overcrowded, with lines at most rides. At the center stood the pirate ship, a swinging boat carrying rows of passengers in wide arcs. It had run all day without problems. Dean Starkey was 41 years old. He worked in construction and had built a reputation among people who knew him as someone who never walked away from a challenge. Not necessarily the dangerous kind, just the kind where saying no felt like losing. He had come to the park that day with his longtime friend, Mario Cole, and the two of them had spent most of the afternoon pushing each other, seeing who would go further. It was the kind of friendship that ran on competition.
It is fun right up until someone takes it one step too far. And the trouble is, you never really know where that line is until someone already crosses it.
They had worked their way through most of the park before reaching the pirate ship. Standing at the entrance, Dean looked at the lap bar and said out loud that it seemed unnecessary for a ride like this one. Mario told him to prove it. That was all it took. I've always thought dares are strange, because they can make smart people ignore risks they would normally recognize immediately. A few people nearby caught the exchange. By the time they joined the line, a small group had already started paying attention. Dean was not bothered by that. If anything, it made him more set on following through. The ride is loaded in rows. A lap bar came down over each seat to hold passengers in during the swing. The attendants gave the instructions before anything moved. Stay seated. Keep the bar down. Do not stand or lean. Dean settled into his seat, glanced over at Mario, and gave him a look that made it clear nothing had changed. Mario was grinning. The boat started slowly, gaining height with each pass. For the first few swings, Dean sat normally. Then, as the arcs grew wider, he began shifting forward in his seat, working himself loose from the lap bar until it no longer held him. Mario was watching. So were the guests nearby who had caught the conversation at the entrance. As the ride climbed into its higher swings, Dean pushed himself partially upright. Enough of his body had cleared the bar that the seat had nothing left to hold on to him. He raised a hand toward the people below. Operators on the ground spotted the movement.
But a ride that size does not stop the moment a button is pressed. There is always a gap between the decision and the stillness.
The boat continued through another swing as the braking sequence began.
As it climbed toward one of its highest points, the force holding riders onto their seats dropped sharply.
Dean was already standing partially free of the restraint. With nothing securing him, he lost contact with the seat near the top of the ark and was no longer being carried through the ride's motion the way the other passengers were. The boat swung forward and dropped hard into the bottom of its arc, snapping direction. Dean no longer had the seat beneath him to follow that change in motion. That shift threw him sideways before the ride had lost any real speed. He struck a steel support beam near the outer perimeter of the attraction and fell into the restricted service area below. The ride came to a full stop shortly after. Mario stayed in his seat while employees cleared the other passengers. Responders moved into the service area within minutes. Dean died there. The investigators confirmed that he died from severe trauma to the head and torso, consistent with the force of striking the support structure at the speed the ride was carrying him. The ride was reviewed and found to be in full working order. The emergency stop had been triggered correctly, but the boat's momentum carried it through another swing before it could slow down. Witnesses confirmed that Dean had deliberately freed himself from the lap bar after being dared to do so. The attraction reopened after investigators found no mechanical problems or safety violations. Dean's death was ruled accidental, caused by leaving his seat during the ride. What stays with me is how little separated a joke from a fatal mistake. A dare that seemed harmless lasted only a few seconds, but the consequences lasted far longer.
The next story also involves someone who refuses to accept a loss, except this one happens on a go-kart track in Tennessee, and things went wrong right after the race was already over.
It was a Friday afternoon on September 25th, 2020 in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. The go-kart track was part of a larger entertainment complex along the main road through town. A group of co-workers had spent the afternoon moving between different attractions as part of a company outing. Toni Munson was 33 years old. She worked as a regional sales representative and had a reputation at her job for turning everything into a competition. Not in a mean way, just in the way where she always had to be the one who came out on top. It did not matter what the activity was. Toni played to win, and she wanted the people around her to know it. The go-kart race that afternoon felt no different from anything else she had decided to be the best at. She had been talking about her driving the entire time they waited in line. A few of her co-workers were already recording before the race even started. There is nothing wrong with being competitive until winning becomes the only version of the story you are willing to accept. The race ran for several laps around the track. Toni pushed hard from the start, working through turns and looking for gaps to pass. The problem was that two other drivers, a teenager and an older woman, held the front the entire time. She went after them more than once. It never worked. When the race ended, Toni crossed the finish line in third place. She slowed her cart but did not stop the way everyone else did. Track attendants began signaling all drivers to reduce speed and pull into the return lane. Toni kept moving.
Instead of pulling into the return lane, she turned her cart the other direction and accelerated past the pit entrance onto a maintenance path running along the outside of the track.
The nearest attendants were stationed around the unloading area and could only watch as the cart moved away from the controlled portion of the course. By the time they realized she was intentionally leaving the designated route, she was already beyond the pit entrance. One employee started toward the emergency controls while others waved and shouted for her to stop, but the cart covered the distance faster than anyone could reach her. Employees at the edge of the course waved and called for her to stop. She did not slow down. Several co-workers who had been recording the race kept filming. Toni moved off the maintenance path and onto a grassy stretch between the track and the outer fence, cutting toward the front of the course. The ground looked flat from a distance. It was not. A raised drainage edge sat hidden in the grass low to the ground, not visible from a moving cart until the wheel was already on top of it. Her front wheel caught it straight on. The cart snapped sideways hard. The force threw her partially from the seat. Her helmet connected with a steel fence post along the perimeter before she had fully left the cart.
The vehicle tipped, rolled over part of her torso, and came to rest against the fence.
Employees ran toward her from across the track. The attraction shut down within minutes. Toni never regained consciousness. The coroner confirmed that she died from head trauma and internal injuries. The impact with the fence post and the weight of the cart rolling over her had both played a role in her death. Investigators later determined that the crash happened after Toni intentionally left the designated course and entered an area that was never meant for riders. The attraction reviewed its barriers and operating procedures, while several of the co-workers who had been filming provided statements about what they had seen. For her family, the outing that began as a routine company event ended with a loss they never expected to face. The next story takes a different turn. No race, no dare, no ride. Just a woman who was told she could not go somewhere, decided that rule did not apply to her, and walked through a door she was never supposed to open. It was a Friday on May 10th, 2019 in Sandusky, Ohio. The amusement park had opened for the season only a few weeks earlier, and the crowd that day was moderate enough people to fill the main areas without things feeling rushed. One of the larger attractions near the middle of the park used a rotating loading deck, a platform that kept turning at a slow, steady pace so passengers could board without the ride stopping completely. Lisa Tiller was 52 years old. She worked as an office administrator and had a long history of pushing back on rules she felt did not apply to her. Policies, procedures, restrictions, she treated most of them as something to argue about rather than simply follow. She had come to the park alone that day, and within a few hours of arriving, she had already found something to challenge. I have come across people like Lisa before, and usually the habit is just exhausting to be around.
But every now and then, that same habit walks someone directly into a situation they cannot argue their way out of.
The trouble started at a ride entrance. Lisa had attempted to access a restricted area, and staff asked her to stay behind the barrier. She refused. The back and forth continued long enough that a supervisor had to step in. She was eventually guided away and told to move along. On her way out, she made it clear she planned to find someone with real authority before she let the matter go. She never found a manager. After walking the outer edge of the attraction, she found a service entrance marked with warning signs and a chain across the opening. She stepped over the chain and went inside. That is the detail I keep coming back to. She had already been escorted away. She had already heard no from more than one person, and rather than letting it go, she found another way in. That is not frustration anymore, that is a choice. The corridor ran behind the attraction and led toward the loading area. The ride was still in full operation. Workers inside spotted her almost immediately and began moving in her direction. The noise from the ride swallowed whatever they were trying to say. Lisa kept walking. The loading deck on this attraction did not stop between riders. It rotated slowly, and without pause, guests stepped on while it turned and were guided to their seats before the cycle completed. To someone unfamiliar with it, the platform looked like it was barely moving. That small amount of movement was enough to matter. She stepped onto the rotating deck. The surface shifted under her feet before she could adjust. One leg dropped into the gap between the moving platform and the fixed edge alongside it. Her body twisted as she went down, and the platform continued turning into her. Workers hit the emergency stop the moment she fell. The platform took several more moments to fully stop. Employees reached her within seconds. Guests on the outer side could see workers gathering quickly near the loading area. The ride was shut down and cleared. Lisa died at the scene. The medical examiner confirmed that her cause of death was crush injuries and internal trauma sustained when her body became caught between the rotating platform and the stationary edge. Park staff and safety officials reviewed everything. The attraction had been operating correctly. The emergency stop had been triggered without delay. Every restricted entrance had been clearly marked. Workers had moved toward her the moment she appeared in the corridor. The chain at the service door showed clear signs of being disturbed. Lisa had entered a working operational area on her own, past posted warnings, after already being removed from the attraction that same day. She had spent years treating every rule around her as one that applied to everyone else.
That afternoon, one of those rules existed to keep her alive, and she stepped right over it in her own way.
The next one moves to a carnival midway in New York, and it started with a man who simply could not stop himself from correcting someone who never once asked for his opinion. It was a Sunday afternoon on July 20th, 2015, at Coney Island in New York. The Midway was busy that day, with people moving between game booths and food stands on both sides of the walkway. Carnival game operators were running demonstrations and calling out to passing guests the way they always do on a crowded summer afternoon. Richie Fallows was 29 years old. A fitness coach who posted amusement park content online, he frequently criticized how attractions were operated and rarely hesitated to explain how he thought things should be done. I think most of us know someone who cannot walk past anything without turning it into a lesson. It is mostly harmless, but sometimes that habit runs directly into a situation that does not care how much you think you know. They were moving through the Midway when Richie stopped at a strength test game, the kind where you swing a mallet onto a pad and try to drive a marker up a tall tower. The operator was mid-demonstration when Richie stepped closer and began pointing out what he felt was being done wrong. The grip, the swing angle, the distance from the pad. A few people slowed down to watch. Phones came out. The operator ran through the technique again, patient and consistent. Richie dismissed it. and told the small crowd forming around him that he would show them how it was actually supposed to be done. He stepped onto the striking platform and immediately repositioned himself. His feet went farther back from the pad than recommended. He moved his hands higher on the mallet handle and explained to the crowd why his method would generate more power. Instead of standing square to the target, he leaned slightly backward and gave himself a larger swing arc. The stance left much of his weight toward his heels and put him closer to the rear edge of the platform. Then he swung. The strike came in at an angle rather than straight down. The mallet head missed the center pad and caught the outer rim of the target housing instead. The impact stopped the head short and sent the handle snapping back through his follow-through. Because he had committed so much of his weight to the swing, the sudden interruption threw him off balance immediately. His back foot shifted as he tried to recover. Then it found empty space. Witnesses saw him stumble backward off the platform. He reached for something to grab as he fell, but there was nothing there. He landed on the concrete midway behind him. The back of his head struck the ground. He stopped moving immediately. The crowd around the game went quiet. People who had been watching moved toward him. His friends pushed through from the side. The game was shut down, and responders arrived within minutes.
Richie never regained consciousness. The medical examiner confirmed that he died from severe traumatic brain injury caused by the back of his head striking the concrete.
Reviewers went over everything. The equipment was in normal working condition. The operator had given correct instructions and demonstrated proper technique more than once before Richie stepped up. Witness accounts were consistent. Richie had repositioned away from the recommended stance, adjusted his grip, and swung at an angle that sent the mallet into the outer housing. Nothing about the game had failed. The approach had. What I cannot get past is that the operator showed him the correct way more than once. And Richie stood right there and decided he still had something to teach. The person who runs that game every single day, and Richie believed he knew it better. He had spent years presenting himself as someone who understood these things at a level most people did not. That afternoon, he stepped onto a platform to prove it. The one thing he never prepared for was being wrong. The last story I am covering today is different from all of them. No game, no ride, no dare. Just a woman who believed her name and her connections put her above a warning that existed for one reason: to keep her alive. It was a Thursday afternoon on October 20th, 2022, in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. The amusement park was open that day, but running with several attractions shut down. A weather system moving through the area had brought strong, steady wind, and one of the closures was an elevated observation platform near the far end of the park, a raised structure that gave visitors a view across the grounds from well above 40 feet up. It had been blocked off since early morning. Evelyn Brady was 58 years old. She had built a successful career as a real estate investor and moved through most of her life with the kind of confidence that comes from rarely being told no. She had come to the park with a group of business associates, and she treated restrictions the way she treated most things that got in her way, as something that applied to people who had not yet made the right introduction.
There is a particular kind of certainty that comes with success, the kind where a person starts to believe the world genuinely works differently for them.
It is usually just frustrating for everyone around them. On this day, it was something else entirely. The observation platform had been closed all morning. Staff had turned away guests throughout the day without exception. When Evelyn and her associates arrived, employees explained clearly that the wind conditions made it unsafe and that the closure applied to everyone. Evelyn pushed back first calmly, then with more force. She referenced her standing, her connections, the people she knew. Nearby guests began paying attention. She was not given access. She also did not leave. Later that afternoon, a maintenance worker arrived at the gate to check the structure. When the gate opened to let him through, Evelyn walked in behind him. Her associates followed. The worker told her to stay outside. She kept moving. The gate opened for one person to do a job. She treated it as an opening made for her. That small moment, almost easy to miss, is where everything shifted. Employees on the ground called up for the group to come back immediately. The wind was hitting the structure in heavy, uneven gusts. Rather than turning back, Evelyn moved farther onto the platform toward the outer railing. Her associates stayed near the gate. She reached the railing and leaned forward, looking out across the park. A gust rolled across the platform. Her footing shifted. She went into the railing hard enough that her upper body crossed over the top rail. She grabbed for the barrier. Her hands did not hold. Evelyn fell to the concrete service path more than 40 feet below. Guests and employees at the base of the structure watched it happen. Responders arrived within minutes. Evelyn was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner confirmed she died from massive trauma consistent with a fall from that height onto a hard surface. Park officials reviewed wind data, data, staff reports, and footage from multiple positions around the platform. The closure had been issued and enforced correctly throughout the day. The gate had been opened for maintenance, not for guests, and Evelyn had been told to stay out both before and after entering. Her associates confirmed the full sequence. The railing had not failed. Evelyn had leaned into it during a gust with enough force that her balance could not recover. What I keep sitting with is that she was surrounded by people the whole time, and not one of them could stop what her own certainty had already decided. She had spent decades building a life where her name moved things that did not move for other people. That afternoon, a gate opened for someone else, for a completely different reason, and she walked through it as though it had been opened for her. It had not. And the wind at the top of that platform did not know her name.